At the previous level, we saw how affection can turn into memory, a moment that once carried such a sense of wholeness that the mind keeps chasing it. Tonight, we go deeper still. Because once attachment has formed, the hardest thing to notice is not what is added to your life, but what slowly disappears. The world around you does not collapse. It quietly withdraws, not by force, not by rules, but by distance. Carl Gustav Jung understood that the most dangerous form of isolation is not when we are cut off from others, but when the psyche stops investing energy in the world. He wrote, "The libido withdraws into the unconscious. When psychological energy retreats into a single object of attachment, the rest of life, friends, interests, doubts, other possibilities, is not forbidden. It simply loses its pull. And when attraction fades, distance forms naturally. That distance does not hurt at first. On the contrary, it feels calm. Fewer voices, fewer choices, fewer conflicts." Jung observed that the human psyche always seeks balance, and when one attachment promises stability, the mind is willing to narrow the world to preserve that anchor. He warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Maintaining a wide world requires facing uncertainty. Shrinking it brings a sense of safety. What is subtle is this: no one tells you to leave the world behind. You withdraw on your own. You share less. You question less. You collide less with different perspectives. Not because you are forbidden, but because it no longer seems necessary. Jung called this identification with the object of attachment when the ego begins to measure reality by a single scale. He wrote, "Identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. In this state, the world does not vanish because it is taken away, but because it is no longer nourished." Distance also operates at a deeper level. It reduces reflection. As the world narrows, the different mirrors of the self disappear. You no longer see yourself in multiple roles, multiple relationships, multiple possibilities. The ego becomes single-toned. Jung understood that diversity of experience is a condition of consciousness. He wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. When opposites disappear, consciousness does not collapse. It falls asleep. And this quietness is easily mistaken for peace." But Jung drew a clear distinction. Peace comes from inner reconciliation, while quiet comes from reduced stimulation. A shrunken world may feel gentle, but it is also fragile, because when the single anchor trembles, there is nothing else left to hold balance. Jung warned, a psyche that has no outside orientation is easily overwhelmed. And tonight, we do not need to conclude anything, only a gentle recognition. If the world around you is slowly disappearing, it may not be because you no longer need it, but because your energy has been held elsewhere. That recognition requires no action. It simply opens a very quiet question. At what distance have I placed the world? And in that question, consciousness begins to breathe again. Slowly, but truly. And when the world no longer disappears by being taken away, but by slowly becoming unfamiliar, isolation begins to enter inner life. So gently that we don't realize we've already walked quite a long distance. Isolation does not begin with prohibition. No one tells you to stop seeing other people. No doors are locked. No orders are given. No villain appears to force you to stay put. Instead, something more subtle happens. You are still free to go anywhere, to talk to anyone, but each encounter with the outside world begins to feel just a little heavier than before. Not forbidden, just uncomfortable. Carl Gustav Jung understood this mechanism deeply. He knew that the most powerful forms of control rarely operate through coercion. They operate through the redirection of psychic energy. Jung wrote, "The libido withdraws into the unconscious. When emotional energy becomes anchored to a central bond, the outer world is no longer approached with curiosity or vitality. It is approached with effort. And anything that consistently requires effort is, over time, quietly avoided." What is striking is this: the avoidance is not experienced as fear. It is experienced as fatigue. Meeting friends feels draining. Conversations that once sparked excitement now feel oddly distant. Laughter no longer lands in rhythm. You leave a gathering unable to explain why you feel emptier than before. Jung would say, this is the sign of a psyche narrowing its field of presence, not because the world has worsened, but because the inner point of reference has shifted. Isolation works by subtly recalibrating emotional standards. When you have grown accustomed to a concentrated source of affection, interactions that do not carry the same intensity are felt as lacking. Not wrong, not bad, just not enough. Jung wrote, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life." When meaning is concentrated in one place, all other places lose color. No one has to take the world away. The mind quietly devalues what remains. This is what makes the process especially dangerous. The illusion of freedom remains intact. You can still go, still speak, still choose. But every choice outside the emotional safe zone carries a sense of misalignment. And instinctively, human beings avoid what feels misaligned. Jung recognized that the ego seeks equilibrium more than truth. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When a particular attachment promises balance, the outer world begins to feel like interference. Isolation therefore needs no walls. It needs silent comparison. Every interaction is measured against an unspoken standard. Does this make me feel as connected as before?" And because most healthy relationships do not operate on extreme intensity, the answer is usually no. So the psyche withdraws a little more, not because it is forced, but because it no longer perceives emotional return. Jung called this a form of identification. When the ego identifies with a single source of connection, all other sources become peripheral. He warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming oneself, requires many mirrors, many relationships, many reflections. When those reflections disappear from daily life because they feel uncomfortable, the ego gradually loses depth. What makes this especially tragic is how easily isolation disguises itself as reason. I'm busier now. I need rest. I've outgrown them. All of these may be partly true, but Jung urged us to look not only at explanations, but at the direction of energy. If energy consistently flows toward one point and withdraws from the rest of the world, this is not merely a change in priorities. It is a contraction of psychic life. Jung wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. Awareness requires contrast to stay alive. Different conversations, conflicting viewpoints, unpredictable relationships. These create the friction necessary for perception. When that friction is avoided because it feels uncomfortable, consciousness does not collapse. It falls asleep. And that sleep is often mistaken for peace. Isolation, then, does not feel dramatic. It feels reduced. Fewer people, fewer voices, less world. And within that reduction, a sense of safety emerges, until the single point of support begins to tremble. Jung warned, "A psyche that has no outside orientation is easily overwhelmed. A mind with no external field to distribute energy becomes fragile. What matters tonight is not forcing yourself to socialize more, nor blaming yourself for withdrawing." Jung never advocated coercion. He simply invited a quiet recognition. If the outer world feels heavier, it may not be because the world is wrong, but because your emotional calibration has shifted. That recognition demands no action. It only opens a sincere question. What am I avoiding when I avoid the world? Within that question, isolation begins to be named correctly, not as a moral failure, but as a psychological movement. And once a movement is seen, it no longer operates entirely in the dark. For Jung, this is always the beginning of inner freedom, not immediate change, but awareness, so that, little by little, the world may find its way back into view. And when isolation no longer comes from the outside, when the world is not shut away but merely begins to feel uncomfortable, the mind does what it does best. It tells itself a story to justify the retreat. Gradually, a story takes shape, not loudly, not dramatically. No one stands in front of you trying to persuade or command you, just small thoughts, appearing at the precise moment when the emotional energy drops. They don't really understand you. They don't see things the way we do. You always feel worse after talking to them. These sentences do not sound like orders. They carry the tone of personal insight, as if you have simply arrived at an obvious truth you hadn't yet named. Carl Gustav Jung understood the power of such stories very well. He knew that the human psyche cannot tolerate prolonged ambiguity. When an uncomfortable feeling repeats itself, fatigue after social contact, emptiness after meetings, the mind seeks a frame of meaning to contain it. Jung wrote, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life, not because we need a true story, but because we need a story we can live inside." And so, the story of not being understood begins to do its work. It doesn't need to be entirely accurate. It only needs to be plausible enough to explain why you are withdrawing. Because withdrawing without a reason hurts. Withdrawing with a reason that sounds wise feels relieving. Jung recognized that the ego is always trying to preserve its sense of coherence, not through absolute truth, but through interpretations that help it remain intact. What is subtle here is this. These thoughts are not imposed from the outside. No one tells you, don't see them anymore. No one says, only we truly understand each other. The story forms from within, as if it were the voice of intuition itself. Jung warned about this phenomenon when he noted that the unconscious can disguise itself as reason. He wrote, "The unconscious can make a fool of you in no time." When an interpretation serves inner protection, it is trusted more easily than any external advice. Jung also observed that when the psyche feels unseen or misunderstood, the natural response is not to seek more connection, but to retreat. Yet this retreat does not occur through obvious social withdrawal. It happens inwardly. He wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. When you believe no one truly understands you, continuing to speak begins to feel pointless, and silence starts to feel safe. At this stage, withdrawal wears the mask of self-protection. You stop placing yourself in conversations that make you doubt yourself. You no longer have to explain, adjust, or tolerate the feeling of being out of sync." Jung would say that the ego is performing its basic function here, avoiding pain. But the crucial question is, which pain is being avoided? The pain of genuinely not being understood, or the pain of allowing the world to challenge a story that has already taken shape inside you? The story, they don't understand you, gradually does more than explain. It begins to shape reality. Every new interaction is filtered through this lens. An offhand remark becomes evidence. A moment of distance becomes confirmation. Moments of warmth are dismissed as exceptions. Jung called this the operation of a complex, a constellation of emotion and interpretation that reinforces itself. He wrote, "Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. Once the not being understood complex forms, It begins selecting experiences that allow it to survive. The danger is this: the story cuts off the path of feedback. If you believe others cannot understand you, you will not try speaking differently. You will not expand your emotional language. You will not allow misunderstandings to be repaired. Jung understood that consciousness develops through dialogue. He wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. When dialogue disappears, consciousness is not attacked, it contracts. That contraction can easily be mistaken for depth. You feel like you know yourself better. You feel less influenced by external opinions. You feel more settled inside your inner world." But Jung drew a clear distinction between living depth and sealed depth. Living depth allows the world to touch you and change you. Sealed depth keeps you safe by preventing anything new from entering. Jung warned that prolonged protection can turn into a prison. He wrote, "What you resist persists. When you continually protect yourself from the feeling of not being understood, you also protect the belief that you cannot be understood. And over time, that belief becomes identity. You are no longer someone who hasn't been understood yet. You become someone who cannot be understood." Jung did not condemn this process. He viewed it with deep compassion, because he knew that every protective story once had a reason to exist. The problem is not whether the story is wrong. The question is what it is doing to your life now. Does it open connection or close it? Does it allow you to be fully present or only help you avoid pain? Tonight, there is no need to reject this story. No need to force yourself back into relationships that exhaust you. Jung never advocated coercion. He simply invited a moment of awareness. Perhaps this retreat is not only protecting you from others, but protecting you from a deeper fear. The fear that if you spoke fully and honestly, you might not be received. And that recognition alone, without any action, is enough for the story to begin losing its absolute power. When a story is seen as a story, rather than as the only truth, the psyche gains space to breathe. For Jung, that space is where healing begins. Not by opening the door immediately, but by becoming conscious of why you closed it in the first place. And when the story, "No one truly understands you," has become solid enough to stand inside the mind, a quieter, yet deeper consequence begins to unfold. The world of dialogue contracts, circle by circle. Over time, the circle narrows. There is no decisive moment, no declaration of departure. Conversations outside begin to feel superficial, not wrong, not malicious, just no longer touching. Different perspectives become uncomfortable, not because they are dangerous, but because they gently shake an inner structure that is already stabilized. Voices that once felt familiar now sound foreign, as if they were speaking another language. And then, you stop debating. You stop responding. You withdraw from dialogue. Not because someone told you to be silent, but because silence feels easier. Carl Gustav Jung understood that this withdrawal is not passive. It is a choice made by the nervous system. When dialogue creates tension, the psyche seeks relief. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium." The human psyche looks for balance before it looks for truth. And when a fragile balance has been constructed by narrowing the world, any voice that threatens that balance is experienced as noise. The Stoics were very clear about this. Clarity requires contrast. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If anyone can refute me, show me I'm making a mistake, or looking at things from the wrong perspective, I'll gladly change." Clarity does not come from defending a position, but from placing it beside other positions. Isolation removes this very condition. When comparison disappears, when friction, challenge, and multi-directional feedback fade, self-correction disappears with them. Jung called this phenomenon a constriction of consciousness. He wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. Consciousness needs polarity to remain alive." When every conversation revolves around the same emotional rhythm, the same perspective, the same reference point, consciousness is no longer challenged. It falls asleep. And this sleep is often disguised as peace. What is subtle is this: withdrawing from dialogue does not feel like loss. It feels light. Less explaining, less defending, less questioning oneself. Jung understood that the ego prefers certainty over openness. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." Genuine dialogue always carries risk. The risk of being wrong, exposed, changed. Silence removes that risk. And so, it is chosen. But the cost of ease is the loss of reflection. When you no longer argue, you are no longer mirrored. Inner contradictions are no longer questioned. Beliefs are no longer tested. Jung warned that when consciousness is no longer reflected, the unconscious fills the space. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When external dialogue disappears, internal voices, often old complexes, begin to speak in its place. Isolation, then, does not need to impose a new truth. It only needs to preserve a single emotional reference point. Everything else is measured against it. If a conversation does not provide the familiar sense of safety, it is dismissed as meaningless. If a perspective does not confirm the central feeling, it is perceived as a threat. Jung called this identification, the ego identifying with a feeling or a single attachment. He warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming oneself, requires multiple reference points. A single one creates dependence. The Stoics would say that when comparison disappears, judgment becomes blind. Epictetus reminded, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Improvement requires a willingness to be challenged. But within the narrowing circle, challenge is no longer welcome. And so judgment does not fail dramatically. It freezes. It does not move forward or backward. It simply repeats. Jung understood that this freezing can last a long time without obvious pain. There is no conflict, no argument, no friction. But he also warned that a psyche without external orientation becomes fragile. He wrote, "A psyche that has no outside orientation is easily overwhelmed. When only one support remains, a single tremor can destabilize the entire inner structure." What matters tonight is not forcing yourself back into debate or expanding the circle immediately. Jung never advocated coercion. He only invited an honest recognition. If silence is becoming easier than dialogue, ask, easier for whom? For truth or for emotional safety? That question is not meant to accuse. It is meant to locate. The Stoics believed that freedom begins with distinguishing what lies within our control and what does not. Here, what lies within your control is not what others say, but whether you allow comparison at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Allowing comparison is an inner act. It does not require a stage." And sometimes, the first comparison does not come from another person. It comes from a very small, quiet question. Is this silence helping me see more clearly, or simply helping me be touched less? Jung believed that when such a question is held with gentle attention, without forcing an answer, consciousness begins to wake, quietly, without drama, but truly. Over time, the circle may shrink, but it can also open again when we allow comparison to return, even in the smallest way. For Jung and the Stoics alike, This is not a step away from safety, but a step toward clarity, where silence is no longer a hiding place, but a pause before dialogue is reborn. And when dialogue has fallen silent, when silence becomes the easiest choice, another consequence quietly appears. Within that narrowed space, any remaining sound begins to echo far louder than it should. In a world that has been narrowed, every sound grows louder. When other voices withdraw, one voice begins to stand out. At first, it is merely familiar, because it is present so often. Then it becomes dominant, because there are fewer alternatives to compare it with. And eventually, it becomes unquestioned, not because it is persuasive, but because the frame of comparison is gone. Truth is no longer tested through multiplicity, it is felt through repetition. Carl Gustav Jung described this state as a closing in of consciousness, not a shutting of the world by command, but a world allowed to contract around a single influence. Jung wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. When opposites disappear, consciousness loses the tension necessary for discernment. It doesn't argue, it receives. And through prolonged receiving, suggestion begins to feel like truth. The subtle danger lies here. That voice does not need to be right. It only needs to be familiar." Jung warned of the power of familiarity when he noted that the unconscious often operates through repeated pathways. The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. But when the unconscious is no longer counterbalanced by a living, dialogical consciousness, it can become a single-toned guide. A familiar voice in a world with few remaining voices is favored by the mind, not for its value, but for its predictability. Here, influence does not come from persuasion. It comes from lack of alternatives. When you no longer hear many perspectives, one perspective does not need to win an argument. It wins by default. Jung called this phenomenon identification, when the ego gradually merges with an influence and loses critical distance. He warned, identification with the object is the greatest obstacle to individuation. Individuation, becoming oneself, requires distance. When distance disappears, the ego loses its capacity to step back and see. In this state, suggestion feels like truth. Not universal truth, but a deeply personal one. It feels right because it aligns with the central emotional tone that has been nurtured. It feels right because no other voice challenges it. Jung wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." When an idea occupies the center of a narrowed world, it is no longer an idea to be examined. It becomes the framework through which reality is lived. The Stoics warned of something similar, using a different language. Clarity requires contrast. Epictetus reminded us, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Growth requires a willingness to be challenged. But in a closed world, challenge disappears. And when challenge disappears, judgment does not immediately become wrong. It freezes. It freezes inside a feeling of certainty. Jung saw the danger here not as being deceived by others, but as being lulled to sleep by consistency. A voice repeated long enough in a non-competitive space creates a sense of safety. That safety causes the mind to lower its guard. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When suggestion operates unconsciously, it is not called influence, it is called my own thought. What is striking is this: truth in this state feels intensely personal. You do not feel as though you are following someone else. You feel as though you are becoming clearer about yourself. And because that feeling is comforting, it is rarely questioned. Jung sharply distinguished between clarity and certainty. Clarity opens, certainty closes. Yet in a narrowed world, certainty is mistaken for clarity. When only one influence remains, even the smallest countersignal becomes uncomfortable. Not because it is wrong, but because it threatens the stable structure. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. The mind seeks balance before it seeks truth. And balance is achieved by eliminating noise. Thus, other voices are dismissed, not out of malice, but because there is no longer room. This is the moment when the closing of consciousness is completed. No walls are needed. No censorship is required. Only a world small enough for one voice to echo loudly. And as that voice repeats, it creates a feedback loop. The more it is heard, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar, the more it is believed. The more it is believed, the more it is heard." Jung called this the autonomous operation of a complex. Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. Once a central complex forms, it draws energy and organizes experience in service of itself. The Stoics would say that inner freedom begins when we reset our standards of what deserves trust. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." That power appears when we allow comparison to return, even in the smallest way. A question, another voice, a pause that allows doubt. Jung did not advise breaking the influence abruptly. He knew such a move could shock a nervous system accustomed to stability. Instead, he invited a humbler act, creating distance. Distance not to oppose, but to see. With distance, suggestion becomes suggestion again. Truth returns to something that must be tested. In a narrowed world, every sound grows louder. But all it takes is a small opening for that sound to return to its true size. For Jung and the Stoics alike, this is the decisive moment. Not when we discover a new truth, but when we restore the capacity to compare. Because only when comparison returns does consciousness awaken. And when consciousness awakens, no voice can dominate merely through familiarity anymore. And when a single voice has echoed long enough in a narrowed world, when it is no longer questioned, but merely repeated, the next thing that happens is not loss, but a shrinking of vision. Imagine a landscape at night. At first, you can still see the horizon, faint but present, reminding you that the world is larger than what lies immediately before you. Then your gaze gradually draws inward. You see only the road ahead. Eventually, even the road disappears. There is only the ground beneath your feet. Nothing has been taken away. No hand covers your eyes. You have simply stopped looking outward, and what remains, because there is nothing left to compare it with, begins to feel sufficient. Carl Gustav Jung understood this movement with great clarity. He knew that consciousness does not collapse because it is deprived, but because it withdraws itself. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When the outer world becomes too vast, too complex, too full of contrasts, the psyche seeks balance by reducing the field of awareness, not in search of truth, but in avoidance of tension. In that darkness, looking only at the ground beneath your feet brings a sense of safety. Fewer questions, fewer contradictions, less unease." Jung warned that the human psyche easily confuses enough with closed. When the horizon is no longer visible, you do not feel lacking. You feel stable. And that very stability makes widening your vision seem unnecessary. Jung wrote a pivotal line, "Consciousness needs opposites. Awareness requires contrasts in order to stay alive. The horizon exists to remind you that other possibilities remain. When you stop looking outward, nothing goes wrong immediately. But consciousness begins to lose depth. It does not die. It settles. And that settling is easily mistaken for peace. In the nightscape of the inner world, What remains feels sufficient not because it is full, but because nothing else is competing with it. Jung described this as a state in which a single image, influence, or emotional structure occupies the entire field of awareness. He warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When only one thing remains within sight, it no longer needs to justify itself. It becomes reality. What is striking is that there is no sharp pain here, no dramatic loss, only a gradual acclimation to darkness. Your eyes adjust, and once they have adjusted, any external light, if it appears, feels blinding. Jung understood this paradox. When the psyche has adapted to contraction, expansion becomes uncomfortable. Not because it is wrong, but because it disrupts a fragile equilibrium. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When not looking outward becomes habitual, it is no longer named avoidance. It is called, "This is enough for me." And enough becomes a quiet destiny. But Jung did not see this as an endpoint. He pointed out that consciousness does not lose its ability to expand. It simply stops using it. The horizon has not vanished. It lies just beyond the field of vision. And all it takes is a very small moment, a question, another voice, a gentle doubt, for the gaze to lift slightly. You do not need to see the entire sky. You only need to remember that it is still there. In that nighttime landscape, the fact that you see only the ground beneath your feet does not mean the world has grown smaller. It only means you have stopped looking outward. For Jung, recognizing this is not an invitation to self-blame, but a restoration of something profoundly human, the capacity to widen awareness once it is safe enough to do so. And sometimes, simply remembering that you once saw the horizon is enough for the eyes, slowly, to begin lifting again. And when the gaze has grown accustomed to the darkness, when seeing only the ground beneath one's feet begins to feel sufficient, one final misconception quietly shapes the way we live. We begin to call familiarity safety. The Stoics warned long ago that dependency grows when we confuse familiarity with safety. Familiarity soothes the nervous system. Safety protects inner freedom. These two are not the same. Yet, in a narrowed life, they are easily exchanged. Carl Gustav Jung observed the same mechanism from the psychological perspective. The ego seeks equilibrium before it seeks truth. When the world has already contracted, anything that does not disturb the balance is labeled safe, even if the cost is a gradual loss of freedom. Isolation rarely feels like loss. It does not hurt in ways that are easy to recognize. On the contrary, it feels peaceful. Fewer voices, less noise. Fewer questions, less anxiety. Fewer frictions, less need to adjust oneself. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. When friction disappears, pain diminishes, and we easily mistake this reduction for peace." But Jung would pause here and ask, what kind of peace? The peace of inner reconciliation, or the peace of reduced stimulation? The second kind is achieved by shrinking the field of life. It is quiet, but fragile, for freedom does not vanish in loud oppression. It vanishes when there are no longer alternatives to compare. Epictetus reminds us, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Mastery of oneself requires contrast between voices, possibilities, paths. When contrast is removed, freedom withers without crying out. Jung wrote, "Consciousness needs opposites. Awareness requires polarity to remain clear. Isolation removes that polarity, and clarity gives way to certainty. Certainty feels smooth. Clarity involves risk. In a world with little friction, risk is avoided, and with it, the capacity to choose. We are not forced to stay. We simply no longer see a reason to leave. The Stoics did not oppose quiet. They opposed quiet that comes at the cost of virtue. Seneca wrote, "Freedom is not the absence of commitments, but the ability to choose and commit yourself to what is best." When familiarity is mistaken for safety, we stop choosing what is better and choose only what is comfortable. Freedom does not disappear all at once. It thins. What is subtle is this: isolation does not lock the door. It draws the curtains. We remain in the room, the light warm enough, everything familiar enough. And because we no longer feel the wind, we call it safe. Jung would say, this is the moment for a gentle doubt, not to shatter peace, but to ask whether that peace is nourishing or numbing the inner life. So the question is not, why do I want peace? The question is, does this peace give me more choice or less? The Stoics and Jung converge on a shared reminder. Freedom is not loud, but it needs space. When that space contracts for too long, calm may remain, but freedom quietly diminishes. Recognizing this does not demand immediate action. It only asks to be named. And sometimes, simply naming it, familiarity is not always safety, is enough for the gaze, very gently, to begin opening a little wider again. And when silence has been mistaken for safety, when having fewer voices begins to feel like relief, a deeper truth quietly reveals itself, without noise, without drama. And here is that quiet truth. A person who has been isolated long enough will begin to call their cage home. Not because it is comfortable, not because it is spacious, but because it is familiar. Carl Gustav Jung understood this paradox of the psyche very well. The ego does not always seek freedom. It seeks predictable stability. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium." When the outer world becomes complex, polyphonic, full of contrast, the cage, with its clear boundaries and few surprises, offers a sense of balance. The cage does not slam shut overnight. It is built from small habits, avoiding difficult conversations, choosing silence over dialogue, keeping distance to avoid being touched. Each brick has a perfectly reasonable justification. And because there is no violence, no command, no visible jailer, the psyche does not call this captivity. It calls it a reasonable life. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When contraction happens unconsciously, it wears the mask of destiny rather than choice. The Stoics spoke of something similar in moral language. Dependence grows when we attach ourselves to what is familiar. Epictetus reminded us, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Mastery of self is not only behavioral control, it is the capacity to rename what we are living. When we call the cage home, we are not lying, we are adapting. And adaptation, though necessary for survival, can become the price paid for freedom. The subtlety lies here. The cage brings peace, less friction, fewer questions, less risk. Jung clearly distinguished between the peace of inner reconciliation and the peace of reduced stimulation. The second comes from shrinking the world to fit one's tolerance. It is gentle, but thin, because when a structure built on familiarity is shaken, the psyche has few remaining supports to distribute the impact. Jung wrote, "A psyche that has no outside orientation is easily overwhelmed." Thus, calling the cage home is not a moral failure. It is a psychological strategy. It helps us sleep. It helps us avoid contradiction. It helps us escape being questioned. But that same strategy freezes the capacity to choose, not through prohibition, but through lack of comparison. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If anyone can refute me, show me I'm making a mistake or looking at things from the wrong perspective, I'll gladly change." When there is no one left to refute us, change feels unnecessary, and freedom quietly fades. Tonight, there is nothing to escape from. Jung never advocated impulsive breakouts. He knew that smashing the cage violently only builds another cage in panic. Instead, he invited something humbler: recognition. Recognizing that what is being called home may only be a familiar structure. Recognizing that familiarity soothes, but does not necessarily keep the soul alive. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is not evil, it is habitual contraction. When that habit is brought into awareness, it loses its secret power. No door needs to be broken, only named correctly. And sometimes, naming alone is enough to create a small opening. At the next level, we will explore what happens when obedience no longer feels imposed, but feels self-chosen. When commands no longer come from outside, but from within. When the cage needs no lock, because we believe we are exactly where we belong. Jung understood this as the deepest layer of false freedom, and also the place where awakening requires the greatest subtlety. But for now, rest. Rest is not surrender. Rest is allowing the nervous system to step down from defense mode. Jung believed that many essential integrations occur when consciousness temporarily withdraws. In sleep, where the unconscious continues its work of reconnecting what has been split. The world does not disappear when you sleep. It waits. And when you wake, even with the faintest awareness that you have grown accustomed to the cage, the first door of inner freedom has already begun to open. Quietly, without drama, but real enough to begin.